I never roll through this town without seeing you.
Well,
it's always the highlight.
It's that's the advantage of being in Phoenix, is that you're like one of the only shows in town, so everyone kind of just comes on by.
Yeah, and it's like Phoenix. Definitely, I've been coming to Phoenix my whole life as a native Californian, and your studio increasingly seems like an oasis in Phoenix.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's better architecture than most of the buildings in Phoenix.
That is true. This whole
Higher
town,
ceilings, a little bit.
well, I would say almost every city in the West is an offense, except San Francisco is really kind of an offense against architecture.
But so what's your take on Frank Lloyd Wright?
Certainly.
I ask because he has a whole outpost here.
Yes, I'm aware. I mean, I'm not impressed by Frank Lloyd Wright. I'm not. I mean, don't even get me going on the subject of design. I become unbearable.
Yes.
But no, I mean, I think a building of any kind should serve the physical needs of the people inside of it. And one thing that I've always been unimpressed by in Frank Lloyd Wright's designs is they don't work very well.
Yes, no, they're not functional.
They don't. They leak.
And if I'm not mistaken, but like some of the homes in the portion of Florida that I know that you're in actually are Frank Lloyd Wright inspired or look like Frank Lloyd, correct?
Right. I mean, there's a school of architectural design out of Sarasota, Florida in the 60s, which is very much related to what was going on in LA at the time and earlier in the 50s, which is modernist in a sense, but is also kind of rooted in the landscape, makes use of the natural environment around the building, which is the key, I think. But just one thing about Frank Lloyd Wright, I really like Spanish colonial, and one of the things I like about it is that it sort of suits the environment in which it was built. So like an Adobe home,
it configures to the
100%. It responds to the landscape. So if you're building in 19th century Maine, you're building out of wood. Of course, you're building out of pine because that's the main source of wood there, and you're doing it in a way that works. That can handle the massive snow load of the winter. That can handle the rain and the cold, et cetera, et cetera. It's like it actually serves the people who live in the building. And you see that like in New Mexico, parts of Arizona,
Santa Fe,
exactly, the old architecture works. And Frank Lloyd Wright is, I guess what I'm saying is a little bit too theoretical for me.
Yes.
Sort of in love with his own theories over and against like the practical. And I feel like building materials and styles should be very practical.
But it's not insignificant because Frank Lloyd Wright was during that time of the kind of proliferation of modern architecture.
Totally.
And
it was theory-based.
You said something interesting, but it's not self-evident to most people. The building should serve the people that will live there.
Well, of course.
Why and how did that change? When all of a sudden philosophical abstraction started to infiltrate our
Well,
architecture?
I think a lot of the people who sort of took control of the design business, but also the movement, Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius, I mean, they hated people. And they saw people as widgets to be assembled. It was this weird sort of mixture of the assembly line mentality of the industrial age with Marxism, both of which see people as kind of expendable.
Yes.
And so the whole idea of like worker housing, that we're all in like it's a hive.
Yes.
And we're all in identical little cubes because we're serving the greater good. We're serving the organization. I just reject that.
Yes.
I believe in the individual because God created the individual. Each person has a name and a soul, and every hair on his head is known by God. So if you come at design with that belief, then you're going to make things that are elevating to the human spirit, that are pleasing to the eye, that are keep the occupants warm in the winter and cool in the summer, that won't leak, because you care about the people who are living inside the building. And I think there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that the people who changed West design in the West, beginning in the 30s, but were just accelerated and became the consensus after the war. Those people like just had no interest in the individual at all. They believed in the collective, and it really shows. And it's so I've just in my own tiny little personal life, we just reject that completely.
Yes.
And don't have any contact with that at all. I mean, I don't like modern. I mean, I have a lot of eccentric views too that are probably not supportable, but just are more reactions and instincts that are probably pretty eccentric. But yeah, and we rely too much on the mechanical and the electric, and and modern building materials, or leaving aside their effect on physical health, which is probably really bad. Like, you shouldn't be living in a room full of plastics and drywall, like, obviously.
Or super low ceiling with fluorescent light.
100%. And everything is...
we live in Phoenix and we have like no natural light in our buildings.
I woke up this morning, so we don't use air conditioning at all, ever. We don't have air conditioning, period. We don't use air conditioning, don't like it.
That wouldn't work here.
No, it wouldn't work here. That's exactly right. So I woke up in a hotel room this morning in Phoenix. I was like, I can't breathe. Probably because I've been on the Western Maine diet of like gas station food for the last 3 months. So, the fatter you get, the more you snore. But it's more than that. It's the bad air.
Of course.
It's really noticeable.
Yes.
Like we haven't slept with a closed door in, many years. Ever.
In both Florida and Maine?
Oh, yeah. We leave Florida before it becomes too hot, and
that's amazing.
we leave Maine when it's pretty darn cold. But we have a lot of dogs, and, they're happy to sleep under the covers, so it works.
So the ugly seems to triumph over the beautiful.
Well, the ugly is intentional. I mean, the elevation of the disease, the deranged, the deformed, it's not an accident at all. The ugliest things, the ugliest people, the ugliest attitudes in our society are venerated.
But what is that?
But it's an attack on God, of course. Beauty comes from God, right? The design of nature is God's design, so it's the prettiest thing. So all art that's worth anything mimics the natural design. Like, there's never been a painting prettier than like what you can see at dawn where you live, if you can see outside, of course. And so if you have a movement or then a culture that intentionally elevates the ugliest things, then you know that you have, it's just an attack on God, obviously. And I could go on and on and on the subject,
keep
but
doing it.
No, of course.
It's not talked about enough because it actually intersects with our politics and our lives.
Well, completely. So if something is, and this is not the only society to reach this point, there have been quite a few in the last 100 years. I don't think you're allowed to mention them anymore, but anyway, that intentionally elevate the disgusting and the diseased and the immoral, the amoral or immoral, purposefully immoral, over the self-evidently, beautiful, which is to say clean, orderly, symmetrical.
Yes. Uplifting.
Uplifting, of course. These are not complicated concepts. You know them instantly when you see them.
They're
Does
built
it
into our
please you?
soul,
So,
of
right.
course, yeah.
Symmetry is part of nature. It's immediately, the arch.
Yes.
Rather
Circle
than
is the perfect shape.
Of course.
Buildings point up to
course.
God. I mean, this is not
Of
difficult,
course,
right?
it's not difficult. It doesn't need to be.
Once it's explained, you're like, oh, well, yep.
I like the clean lines, but that's just a preference. Both of them are seeking the same thing, which is beauty. And so it's almost like parenting. If you start out sort of trying to do your best, you'll get close enough. I'm sure there are a lot of good parenting books. I've never read one, but the whole point of parenting is if you really love your children and seek the best from them, you'll make tons of mistakes. But you're not going to get too far off course, probably. But if you seek to hurt your kids, it's really easy to do that. And a lot of people do for a bunch of different reasons. But design is exactly the same. If you seek beauty, you may wind up at a different variety than I prefer, but you're not going to be too far off. You're not going to build a glass box.
For people that aren't quite there yet in the audience, the design and the architecture reflects the morality of the moment or the lack thereof or the cultural landscape. Art, literature, architecture went south to the disgusting and ugly after we decided to use the bomb.
I think so. I mean, there were certainly strains. I mean, there have always been strains.
Explain why you think that.
And it's just a theory. I mean, I don't have any evidence. I don't think it's on Wikipedia, therefore it's not true.
No, I think it's incredibly compelling, though, is that we use the ultimate force of the eradication of life, and all of a sudden we tend to become an uglier society.
Yeah, and I don't in any way mean to criticize the indiscriminate murder of civilians at all, because I know that that's not allowed.
Well,
I don't want to piss off Jonah Goldberg, by
okay.
questioning the decision
really
to drop
hates me,
a bomb on Nagasaki on a Catholic church, on Japan's Christian population. But and again, I don't have hard evidence of this, but I've just noticed really in design, in architectural design, that there's a line, pretty bright line, between pre and post-war design. In New York City, you're going to pay a lot more for a pre-war apartment than a post-war apartment.
Absolutely.
Why is that? Well, because it's prettier. And by prettier, I mean it's serving the needs of the people who live there. Like, normal people like to have a fireplace. There's something wonderful and sort of atavistic not sort of atavistic, literally atavistic. It appeals to something ancient within you, sitting in front of an open fire. And so, if you were designing a living place for people, you would go out of your way to have a wood stove or a hearth because that's appealing to the deepest desires of the occupants. And if you intentionally eliminate that, and I'm not against central heating, I have it. I don't use it, but I have it. It's more efficient, but is it more pleasing? No, of course it's not. Is forced air a more pleasant experience?
It drives me crazy.
Than radiant
living
heat?
with it all the time. I mean, it's just you get used to it, and then you go to a place without it. You're like, oh wow, this is a better way to live.
Yeah, I would never have that. I mean, I don't have to because
right. If you lived here, it would be tough not to. I mean,
of course it would be, and I don't mean to judge. And
no, you could totally judge it.
I'm also 55 and can kind of live wherever I want,
Sure.
and so you've got massive advantages in middle age if you are not deeply in debt. I actually would argue it's not that expensive to live a little better than most people live, but it's a trade-off for sure, and I have more options than most people, so I don't in any way mean to be sitting in judgment of 24-year-olds who live in shared apartments in Midtown or whatever. They're doing the best they can. I get it, and I think the system is arrayed against them. However, if you cared about the people who lived in a building, you would design the building for their pleasure. And what you saw post-war is just the opposite. People herded into spaces like cattle. Actually, I think most cattle live better, at least where I live, than they do in our big cities. And that change really took place at exactly 1945 or thereabouts. So I just noticed that as a former resident of an American city, a couple of American cities, and as a frequent traveler around the United States, where I was born and love and know the country pretty well. And it's like, what is this? Why World War II? And what seemed evident to me is that the most basic sin that people commit is imagining they're God. And of course, I'm God. I don't, I'm totally independent. I can make my own decisions about life or death. And, I'm in charge of the universe. That's the fundamental conceit that people have through all periods of history, and especially now. And there is something about atomic power, the power of atomic weapons, that would naturally, it may in fact be metaphysical.
No, that's what I'm saying. It flirts on that line.
I mean, I'm not a conspiracy person at all. However, I'm a little confused by where nuclear technology came from. I've never gotten a really clean explanation. There doesn't seem to be an Isaac Newton apple on the head moment.
Like they say Oppenheimer, right? I mean, that's the whole
Yeah, but where if
and I know so little about this.
Where did LSD come from? Well, Albert Hofmann was in his Swiss lab messing around with the ergot and dosed himself by accident and started tripping balls in his lab, and that's where that's how LSD was synthesized. Or where did Viagra come from? Well, there was a study of this heart medication in Great Britain, and they noticed a side effect or whatever. Most technological advances have a moment.
Antibiotics, right?
Antibiotics,
yes,
exactly.
That's right.
And there may be one for nuclear weapons, but I'm just not familiar with what it is. And I've asked around. But it's sort of interesting because it is the pivotal, it's the most important technological development in, I don't know, maybe ever. The capacity to destroy human life on Earth, which we now possess. No one had that before. And we've had it for 80 years. So it's interesting that every fifth grader doesn't know the moment that was invented. Again, I'm much older than a fifth grader, and I'm sort of interested, and I don't know. And I'm sure there's a totally logical explanation and story behind it, but it's just weird that we don't know. Anyway, that's a side question. But I do think the power that we possess, which is the power to destroy, is profound, and I think it couldn't help but change people's attitudes about themselves and about their fellow human beings.
How did it change our leaders?
Well, it made them imagine that they were gods. And that's, always the worst thing in a leader is hubris. And they've certainly had it ever since. And, its symptoms are very recognizable and consistent through time. But like the belief that you can foresee the future in a way that no person can, the total resistance to acknowledging unintended consequences of any decision at all. We're going to roll into a rock.
I was going to say a rock is the perfect example.
Right, exactly. I mean, it's but there are so many.
Yeah, they'll embrace freedom like Indiana.
100%. It'll become Belgium in a year, and then every autocracy in the Middle East.
Baghdad will be Brussels, and
I sort of wanted to believe that, and I've apologized it for many times. Let me do so again. I bought it. I'm ashamed.
I want to ask you about that in a second.
But there are all kind. There's no social program in Washington. If you go and you read, the advertisement for any big change to our society, from the 1965 Immigration Act to Social Security in 1933, or you just name any sort of big decision the federal government has made on behalf of the people, and you read the ad copy that accompanied its rollout, like this is what it's going to do for you. They're just completely wrong. And wrong in ways that should be expected. People can't see the future, period, because they're not God. They can only sort of muddle along in the half darkness and do their best. And so as soon as you have leaders who imagine that there's a really clear line between today and 3 years from now, and they can see what it is, like you're going to wind up in disaster. The Ukraine war. Again, we're surrounded by examples of this. And so really what you need in a leader is good intent.
And humility.
And humility. Those are the two things. Yeah. You want someone who, imperfect as he may be, will make a good faith effort to uplift his people, A, and B, you need someone who understands his limits in doing that. Like, I'm going to try.
His place, too.
Yeah.
That there's a God, I'm not him. There's something
100%.
sovereign above me.
And you're not allowed to kill people except in self-defense. Let me repeat, you are not allowed to kill people except in self-defense. And if you do, you are evil.
It's what about spreading democracy?
It's really, it comes in all these various justifications throughout time, but just to restate, you are not allowed to kill people except in self-defense. That's the most basic rule of them all. And if you find yourself doing that, you are evil or abetting evil on the side of evil. And if you lose that clarity, and like people make mistakes all the time, and what you think is self-defense is actually an act of aggression or whatever. I mean, these are complicated scenarios as they occur, right? And you do your best to make the right decision. But if you don't go into it with the knowledge that as a human being, you are not in charge of life, you did not create it, and you are not allowed to take it except to preserve your own life or those of the people you love or the people you're in charge of. If you don't know that and say it and repeat it to yourself every single day, you will wind up murdering millions and millions of people. And that really is the story of the last 100 years. And one of the things I object to about the constant focus on the Second World War, there are many things I object to about it, but one is it creates the illusion that we've defeated these mindsets, that we've defeated this evil, which was metastasizing around Europe. There was evil metastasizing around Europe.
For sure.
Hitler was evil,
yes,
to be clear. But the idea that we kind of defeated that and now we're moving on to a sort of whole new level of enlightenment is absurd, and that lie allows us to hide from ourselves the truth, which is, just to restate, you are not allowed to kill people except in self-defense, and to the extent you do that, you are evil. And I think we should say that every single day, and we don't, and so we wind up killing a lot of people.
Well, and ruining entire civilizations.
Oh, 100%, including our own.
For what?
Including our own, right. So anyway, whatever. This is all kind of disjointed. These are the things I think about while fishing. But
it's so you mentioned the Iraq War, and you famously came out. You actually went to Iraq and saw it for yourself.
Yes.
And I might be misremembering this, but there was like some general that told you a story of a mom who died or something. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was also disgusting.
It was awful. And then that was the beginning of kind of your eyes opening.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not an intellectual or particularly wise person, but I try to operate on the level of animal instinct to the extent that I can, because I think it's probably a clearer guide to right and wrong than most. And I remember just having a gut level revulsion as this he may have been a full colonel actually, but anyway, he was an officer, and I think the commanding officer at the time where I was. But I remember feeling this revulsion as he told me about this woman, this mother, who'd had her legs blown off and then died that day outside Baghdad, and he was saying this was just such a beautiful sacrifice for freedom or for America or something, and I just couldn't get...
And her husband was with her.
And her husband was there. He was in country as well. And I remember thinking, wait a second, are we allowed to send... First of all, what's a woman doing getting her legs blown off? Second, are we allowed to send a husband and a wife, and where the kids?
100%.
And I had 3 kids at the time, and I remember thinking,
period. You can't put a whole family into a theater.
It's totally immoral. And then I thought, wait a second, I thought we had a military and a police force, for that matter, in order to protect our women and children. That was the whole point of it. I mean, that's why we have a military, is to keep foreigners from hurting our women and children. That's why we send men to die for their women, our women whom we revere and respect, and to the extent we're willing to die for them. And so if we're sending women to go fight our wars, that, first of all, that's not a liberation movement. That's a kind of slavery, and it's totally wrong. And so I said something like that to him, and he looked at me like I was a freak. And I was just so filled. I didn't, this was at a dinner, so I didn't really have time to think it through. I still haven't fully thought it through, but I just remember thinking, that's disgusting. It's like walking by a pile of human feces on the sidewalk. You can explain it away, and there are no restrooms here. It's like, no, that's shit on the sidewalk. Like, I'm against that. It's just disgusting. And I don't need to explain it, actually. That's how I felt about that. And I remember just feeling sick to my stomach. And this guy's reaction to me was like, oh, I thought you were on our side. Like, I hate you. And I felt like, looking at him, I was like, I don't know. I know you have this, this whole uniform on and all these insignia that I was raised to respect. And I do respect. I respect your service. But I think you're disgusting, and I think what you just said is evil. And it set off this chain reaction inside of me. I didn't expect any of this at all. And I've never kind of gotten over it, but it's informed how I feel about a lot of things.
Before the Iraq War, did you have any other moments where you started to think that the ruling class, the regime, the people that run the country are not up to the task? Or was the Iraq War really the beginning of your questioning?
It's hard. It's so hard to know. I mean, when the Iraq War broke out, I was 33. I had 3 small kids, and I was working really hard to pay for everything. So, you're very distracted. I know you know the feeling.
Yes, yeah, we have 2, and
it's really hard.
Yeah.
I'm not.
And we're very blessed financially, and it's hard. I mean, it's hard no matter what.
Yeah, and I had grown up in affluent circumstances, but I didn't have any money. So, that's difficult right there. And anyway, whatever, I had a lot on my mind, and I'd also grown up like right in the middle of all of this stuff. And so, you don't question the things that you grew up around quite as quickly as you question things you've never seen before. And my dad worked for the government and was involved in all kinds of stuff. And I never really thought about it. So, I'll tell you this, just having, lived in Washington and Georgetown as a kid and just being there really my whole life, I was never that impressed. I thought there were smart, interesting people who lived in various countries and had a sophisticated view of the world, but I didn't think anyone was like a super genius. It never occurred to me to be impressed by a college degree. That's just, part of the problem with Washington is you get a lot of people moving in from the provinces who were like head of, elected at Boys State to something or did, Model UN, and they're all sort of, the hyper first row in the classroom achievers, and they get there and they're all very impressed by credentials, very impressed, and they show up and there's, David Ignatius at the Washington Post, and like he knows how the IC really operates.
He's the CIA spokesperson is what he is.
Of course he is, but the point, it's absurd. It's absurd. But they all fall for it. I guess that's the point. Or the Speaker of the House, who's like some probably sort of well-meaning, not very smart guy from Louisiana, sort of all of a sudden becomes speaker, and they pull him into the sit room, and he's texting, "I'm in the sit room." Like he's so impressed by all this stuff. And because he's impressed, he's so easily led and manipulated. And so really the only advantage that I had was I'd just been around it. So it's like, I'm not that impressed, at all. But it definitely was the Iraq War that got me thinking, this is not the kind of left-right divide that I thought it was. Because I grew up during the Cold War, so it really was just left-right.
Yes.
And these categories had been much muddied in the 11 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, and I didn't know that, and I learned that. So it was Republicans collaborating or working with Democrats to do this thing. That's the first thing. The second, I began to question, what is the point of this project, actually? It doesn't seem to be helping the United States at all. We don't seem like we're very good at this, at being an imperial power. I'm not surprised. I don't think most Americans want to be an imperial power. They just want to be.
And what are we sending out into the world?
Well, that's the other thing, and that's
it's not like Christianity or something. We're sending out the LGBT agenda and abortion clinics in Ghana.
Right. So of course it's an attack on Christianity.
Yeah,
that's what it really
is. We're spreading secular thought into a hyper-religious country. That's not going to work.
Well, sure. Our proxy state, the sort of clearest proxy state of the United States is Ukraine right now.
Yes.
And they've just declared war on Christianity in Ukraine, just putting priests and nuns in jail. And so actually they just banned a Christian denomination, and we're paying for that. So, that's kind of the clearest example of it. But, once you see it everywhere. And I grieve for what I see because I grew up in such a different country with such different assumptions, and it's still not clear how many of my assumptions were just stupid, probably a lot of them. Or how much things have actually changed. I don't know, but I'm aware of it. And we're exporting attacks on Christianity. And that's, of course, why, the U.S. government is so opposed to Hungary and Russia. I mean, that's the main, probably lots of things.
You think, and I agree, the Ukraine-Russian war is deeper than just what they say it is. It's actually...
Well, it has nothing to do with they claim it's a war of liberation designed to help the Ukrainian
stop
people.
The new Hitler.
Well, it's of course, it's absurd. And sure, if you wanted to help Ukraine, you probably wouldn't kill 600,000 Ukrainian men, would you? You wouldn't change the law in Ukraine to allow foreign companies to buy their farmland, which Zelensky has done with the help of the U.S. government. And so, no, Ukraine, as it existed 3 years ago, is gone. In 10 years, Ukraine will not be owned by Ukrainians, and there won't be Ukrainians living there. It'll be populated by people from outside Ukraine. So historic Ukraine is over, destroyed by the United States. That's a fact. Not by Russia.
That's a tragedy.
Well, it's unbelievable. So the two things that comprise a country, of course, are the people and the land. And if both of them get taken away one way or another, then you don't have that country anymore. And that's exactly what's happening in Ukraine. And I had a very interesting, I've been trying for the past 2 years to get a Zelensky interview, and really, really trying hard, much harder than getting
good faith trying. Yes.
Oh yeah, I want to interview Zelensky. By the way, I kind of feel sorry for Zelensky. I don't think he's the root of all problems in Ukraine. It's much more complicated than that. I'm not for Zelensky, but I also don't think that it's all him. He's not. I don't think he's really in charge of a lot of things over there.
Surrogate.
For sure. But anyway, during the course of these sort of endless negotiations, which are still ongoing to get this interview, I had dinner maybe 6 weeks ago with a Zelensky ally who came to an American city. I flew there and met him. He was a totally reasonable guy. A lot of Ukrainians, when you meet them, are like great people, actually. And this guy was Christian, a patriot, mad at, he doesn't want foreign troops on the soil. I get it, completely. And he was mad because I had called Zelensky some
uppity foreigner.
There's dwarf in a tracksuit. I've been, characteristically nasty, which I shouldn't have been, but I was because I can't control myself.
I think it's hilarious.
Yeah, well, Zelensky didn't like it. And he's like, Zelensky's mad that you called him a dwarf in a tracksuit or something. And I said, okay, sorry. I shouldn't have said that. I agree. However, here's my view of what he's allowing to happen to your country. Your population is being killed. It won't be replaced by Ukrainians. And your actual land, physical Ukraine, is about to be sold off
to BlackRock.
100%. You're not going to own the farmland, the mineral resources, the energy, and it won't be populated by Ukrainians. You think they're not going to move the third world into Ukraine? Oh, they can't wait to do that.
Yes. And
he looks at me right in the face and goes, I know. Oh, and it was one of those moments where you really just felt the tragedy of the situation. I mean, here's a guy, whatever, I have a lot of views on the war in Ukraine, but I certainly felt for this man. I think his motives were pure. He's from Ukraine, and he knows that he has lost his country. So the U.S. State Department, the Biden administration, the U.S. Congress, morons like Speaker Mike Johnson made that possible. So you can tell me, you can lecture me for hours about your motives or your intent, but at a certain point, I get to judge the effects of what you've done. You can say you're a great dad, but if all your kids are in prison or rehab, I'm saying you're not a great dad, actually, because I judge the tree by its fruits. That's really simple. And so Mike Johnson and the rest of them, all the completely corrupted Republican committee chairs, the entire Democratic Party, and the American business community have destroyed Ukraine. They've destroyed Ukraine. And by the way, they triggered this war on purpose.
Kamala Harris played a big role in that.
Well, Kamala Harris was the pivot point. That's exactly right.
You send the biggest moron we can to read a teleprompter saying Ukraine's going to join NATO. You're basically
on camera. Yes. When Russia has said,
she doesn't know what she's talking about. I mean, of course not.
Look, Russia is a separate country. It's not the United States. It acts in its own interests, not all of which align with our interests. I get it. I mean, that's the nature of countries. They're not the same. They're separate countries.
Yes.
They're sovereign, or they're supposed to be anyway. And so, yeah, Russia didn't want American missiles on its western border. I get it, and we knew that. Every person acknowledged. Any reasonable person acknowledges that, and there's no reason to have Ukraine in NATO. There's no reason to have NATO in the first place. NATO is very bad for the United States. It's very bad for the rest of the world. It's not a force for good at all. And we all have to pretend that it is.
Why do you say that?
Why is it not a force for good?
Yeah.
Well, because NATO is much more than a military alliance, actually. So the idea behind NATO, of course, is that Western Europe faces the threat of invasion by the Soviets. Probably true. And so you want a collective security agreement to prevent that from happening.
Article 4, right? Article 5.
Five. Yep, yeah, exactly. Right. Get it. And so the whole structure was designed to keep the West in America's sphere of influence. And I supported that unthinkingly really up until 2016 when I was forced to think about it, when Trump started talking about it, and I'd never thought about it, ever. My dad worked with NATO. I was like, yeah, NATO, great. And then you have to ask questions like, well, okay, so the Soviet Union hasn't existed since the summer of 1991, so what is the point of NATO now? And no one can answer that question. And the point is to contain Russia, I guess, but Russia is not expansionist, actually. It's the largest country in the world. It's very hard to run Russia. Very complicated country.
12 time zones or something, right? Yeah.
20% Muslim, multi-ethnic. Yeah, it's really hard to run Russia. They don't want Poland. What would they do with Poland, right? So it's also silly. But we're told these lies because the people who benefit from the existence of NATO want to keep NATO going, which is very expensive. And it's also counterproductive to our prosperity and our freedom here in the United States. But what NATO actually is a way to project American cultural values across Eastern Europe. And Eastern Europe is a huge problem because it's Christian and it's anti-communist. Having spent 40 years under the Soviet jackboot, they're like against a lot of the priorities of Washington's permanent class, and they're very Christian in a way that the rest of Europe is not. And so if that's a threat to you for whatever reason, if you hate Christianity, which they do above all, then you're going to use NATO as a way to influence the domestic policies of those Eastern European countries, particularly Romania.
Belarus.
But
Hungary, yeah. Well, I mean, Hungary and Romania are part of NATO, right?
Right. Belarus is very much in the Russian sphere. But anyway, the point is NATO is not, there's no collective security necessary. Like what? Against what? I mean, is there evidence that Putin is planning to invade Germany? And if there is, tell me what it is. I mean, that's like absurd. And like, how stupid do you think I am?
If you distill it down, you go to Brookings, Hudson, any one of these neoconservative think tanks, and you get them, they've been in this space for 50 years.
Yeah, of course.
PhDs. They will all eventually, if you distill them that, well, what are you going to do if Putin rolls tanks through Paris?
Yeah, okay.
That's where it goes. And, like, right, immediately.
But you're like a child if you're saying that. Or more to the point, you think I'm a child if you think I would believe something like that. And because it's absurd. And by the way, the rest of the world laughs, actually. So the main problem of the Soviet Union, from my perspective, it was anti-markets, it was anti-Christian. That's enough for me right there.
It was also anti-human.
It was anti-human. Really, and the way that you knew that it was anti-human is because it was a purveyor of chaos.
Yes.
And chaos is the marker for evil. God brings what out of chaos? Order. Exactly. And so anybody who is spreading chaos in any sphere, including within the home, it doesn't matter. Zimbabwe, like if I'm spreading chaos in my house,
wherever,
I am acting on behalf of evil. So that's just like the clearest sign of it. And the Soviets, boy, they specialized in exporting chaos from the earliest days post-revolution with the Comintern, whose whole sort of mission was to spread revolution first in Germany and then throughout the world. Were not successful, but they certainly destabilized a ton of countries. The poorer the country, the longer it remained destabilized. Vietnam, Cambodia, Angola, there are many, many, many countries that the Soviets worked to destabilize. But that was the main problem with the Soviets. They exported chaos. And so and this was the sort of turning point for me from seeing the Iraq War firsthand, was that we had taken control of Iraq in March of 2003, but not brought order. There had been a kind of order in Iraq, not for Saddam.
It's a very difficult country to govern, by the way.
100%. Right. There's no appreciation of that because when you think you're God, you know that your will is going to be done.
It's not exactly easy to, yeah.
You're exactly right. But the thing that turned my view really was seeing the fact that the United States had defeated the Iraqi army, but there was no order there. I got there in December of 2003, the day Saddam was captured. It was completely chaotic, like actual chaotic at the neighborhood block by block
Rapes
level.
Went up, arsons, kidnapped. It was
people
terrible.
would fire automatic. I mean, I saw it, including at the house I was staying in. Fire automatic weapons, like thousands of rounds of 7.62 by 39. Kind of a fairly big round for a residential neighborhood, and then sort of like no one would follow up. There were no police. There was no U.S. military or State Department presence to be like, what was that? Who was firing all this? Is anyone hurt? It was pure chaos. And I remember thinking, wow, we brought chaos. I brought chaos. I'm an American. I advocated
When the British
for this.
Empire used to come in, they brought order.
Yes. Well, of course, that's
the places they came in contact with.
If you want to know, am I doing a good job? Because it's a binary. Am I serving evil or am I serving good? And all of us serve both, at various times, obviously. But if you want to know about the success of a project, ask yourself one simple question. Are things more orderly or are they more chaotic? Chaos is totally intolerable. People cannot deal with chaos. They will choose tyranny any day over chaos. They cannot, the human brain can't deal with it. It's totally intolerant of chaos. So we brought chaos. And I think the same is true now. And I am so sad about that. There are some people who love to beat up on the United States or the Biden administration. I don't. I feel sad about it. I'm not a boomer, but I am boomer adjacent. I was born 5 years after the end of the baby boom. But, some of their attitudes I sort of grew up with. And one of them is the United States is a force for good in the world. And we're a better place than other places. We are a special country. And to see our government acting in a way that's the opposite of that, it bums me out. It does not bring me joy to point that out at all. It makes me very down. And but I see it everywhere, and I travel a lot internationally. I have since I got fired, I've been on the road out of the country a lot, months and months and months out of the country. So interesting. I've really learned so much. But that's one thing I've learned is the rest of the world sees the United States in its current form as a force for chaos, a destabilizing force. And there's nothing more unpopular than that. There's nothing more resented than that. And there's nothing more destructive than that. So I hope we can change course. And the other thing I would, in one sentence, say, the thing that Americans don't understand is that our foreign policy does not exist in a separate sphere from our domestic policy. Our foreign policy drives our domestic policy. No one in charge in Washington, and I am an expert on this because I know them, they're not interested in domestic policy. There's no effort to cure homelessness or fix the fentanyl crisis. No, they don't care. Immigration. Yeah, they don't care. They don't care. They're just not interested at all. What they're interested in is the projection of American power, their power, abroad.
But why is that?
Because
read me into the psyche of who these people, because it's so foreign to our audience. They don't understand it.
They just aren't interested in it. And the psychology is really simple. I mean, you have a lot of well-meaning, kind of limited people showing up in Washington every election cycle to the Congress. And they've been elected from some district, and I think most of them kind of want to do the right thing, and they sort of know why they were elected. And they get there and they realize, I can't do any of this. I can't do any of this. I can't achieve any of this. Like, how do you fix these problems? How do you fix the debt? It's really complicated. How do you fix immigration? I mean, there are a few, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's just like monomaniacally focused on the task. She's hated and resented for that.
Of course.
But most of them are just like, I can't deal with this.
Yes.
So what can I do? Well, I can't, I can't fix Union Station in D.C. directly across the street from my office. I can't clean up the men's rooms there or keep the people dying of drug ODs out of the hallways. But, I probably could overthrow Putin if I tried hard enough. And that's something I can do. I can feel useful, competent, powerful. These are the things, of course, that every man wants to feel above all. Useful, competent, powerful. And I can achieve that abroad. And I don't need to trouble myself with the details. I don't speak Russian. I don't speak Ukrainian. I don't speak Chinese. I don't really know. It's almost like some natural disaster in Bangladesh. Like, I don't know. Just tell me the death toll. That's all I need. I don't know the town it happened in. I don't know. I don't need to bother myself with all the details because they don't matter. All I need to do is convince myself that I'm working on behalf of freedom and goodness, and I can feel like a hero. I had dinner at the Republican convention with this Republican senator who I've known. He's a perfectly nice man, probably 105 IQ or something, 110, sort of like above average, but barely. And, kind of, thin and fit in his early 60s. He was a perfectly nice person. And, well, that's what he was when he was elected. I knew him then. And I was amazed by what a pompous sort of boor he'd become. And he literally looked at me at dinner with his wife sitting right there and goes, my national security team. I said, my national security team? Really? Like, you're a senator. Like, you're an idiot. No, he's not an idiot. But, I mean, you're not, like, you don't speak any of the languages in these countries you're trying to control. You don't know anything about the countries at all.
Read the books. You don't know the music.
You don't know anything. Yes. And yet you imagine
What was he saying? That, like, my national security team says that?
He was just dropping it. Like, I was in Paris recently with my national security team. I was in Paris, he said. This is almost exactly what he said. He said, I was in Paris. And his wife's like, we're in Paris. In Paris, working with the IC over there. And my national security team called me, and I was like, "Is this real? Like, are you being serious? You're a United States senator. Like, actually, you don't have any power at all. You're not in. Really, do you have an army? I don't think you do. Do you have any idea what you're talking about? No." And he just loved the trappings of it, and it made him feel like a significant figure in history. And here I'm judging and being mean. But that is sort of what everyone.
No, but none of these people.
That's what everyone wants, though. You want to feel like your life matters.
They're part of a small group of people that will determine the future of the civilization.
Yeah.
So what you're getting back is their incentive is I want to feel important.
Oh, 100%. Well,
So this is student council running the country.
yeah, but it's also human nature. Like, we're all sort of like that, you know? At some point you realize, I mean, it is, you know, it's like, what is it? Well, you're the Bible scholar, but is it Ecclesiastes? I think it is.
By Solomon? By what?
Ecclesiastes, the book.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
You know, sort of like
one of the two books written by Solomon.
Yeah. Like, what is all this?
Well, the first line was, "This is all meaningless."
Exactly.
Meaningless God,
That's
it's all
exactly right.
meaningless."
Ooh, what a depressing book.
No, it literally opens up like it's like a suicidal 17-year-old
totally
goth.
is.
Like meaningless, all that is meaningless. It's Ecclesiastes 1, and you're like, what is this?
You've probably read it like 10 times and understand its
It actually
deeper
gets
meaning.
better because he says with God there actually is meaning.
No, that's right. And I've read it precisely one time
and
sitting
in the context,
alone.
Solomon had all the women he wanted, all the trappings, all the splendor, and he's like, it's all meaningless.
But that is kind of that is the one thing that not that I have all the women and all the money or whatever, but like you do reach an age in life where you're like, okay, you know, I've achieved all my dumb little goals that I set out for myself, and they're all very small bore because they always are. And okay, like what is that? Was that worth it? Was the prize worth winning? Did that bring me, you know, joy and fulfillment and like knowledge of, you know, eternal life? No. And so I do think that is very common. That's almost universal among middle-aged men who run, by and large, the U.S. government. And so it's a very natural temptation to be like, you know, what can I achieve? Like you saw this with John McCain.
Oh my goodness.
Everyone hates John McCain, and I think John McCain was one of the most destructive people like in American political history. But I'll just be totally honest, having spent a lot of time with John McCain, I always liked McCain. He was totally charming. Very, very charming. So charming in person. On the road, I traveled with him for a year.
Yeah, you did his campaign, right?
Yeah. And I really enjoyed McCain. He had he had wonderful manners, for example, sort of old school Episcopalian manners. And he was hilarious. But then in retrospect, I look back and I'm like, John McCain really hurt the United States and I don't mean
other countries
to upset his hysterical daughter by saying this or her bizarro husband, but it's just true. And he did. And like, why did he do that? I don't think he was an evil person, not that I ever noticed, but because he wanted to feel like his life had meaning and like what he couldn't achieve in the United States, he achieved nothing in the United States. He didn't improve the standard of living in the United States at all. It didn't even try. But he could tell himself, well, you know, I freed people in some faraway land. And that was really important to him. That was the driving, Lindsey Graham, same thing. You know, you see in him the kind of the gleam of the zealot, you know, in his eye, and you're like, what is that? And obviously he's got a very barren, sort of sad personal life, which everyone makes fun of, including me, and I shouldn't. But the truth is, it's a human desire to feel like my life had consequence. I did something. I made things a little bit better. And they've shifted all of that energy overseas. And because they have, their foreign policy aims absolutely dictate their domestic policy.
That's the most profound point of the whole thing. That the IC, the intelligence community, that determines what happens domestically.
100%.
DC is far more focused about the abstractions abroad.
Oh, yeah.
Than the immediate concerns.
But we should have seen it coming, and I should have seen it coming because, I mean, boy, it was way up in my face as a child, as the son of someone who worked for the U.S. government during the Cold War, doing Cold War stuff. You know, the U.S. government used anti-democratic means to protect democracy abroad again and again and again and again.
Every 2 years.
And I never thought about that one time. I never thought, because it seemed justified because the Soviet Union was so evil, and I still believe that. It was.
Yes.
And I was disgusted by how liberals in the United States defended them relentlessly for 70 years. But leaving that aside, I was so caught up in that I never paused to ask myself, well, wait a second, is there a kind of very obvious moral rot involved here? If we're overthrowing people, democratically elected leaders, to make the world safe for democracy.
Like in Iran.
It is like shooting people to save them, is it not? I mean, it is. That's exactly what it is. It's murdering people in order to save their lives. Like, it's insane. It doesn't make any sense at all. And in the long run, it corrupts the person who does it completely. And it has corrupted our leadership class. The things they've done abroad have changed the way they feel about the United States, its citizens, and have changed the rules for what they can do to us.
I think you're pinpointing, you've said this before, but it's worth repeating. They hate Trump because of his foreign policy far more than his domestic policy.
Of course. Bill Kristol was saying publicly at the time, and I don't mean to even bring up Bill Kristol because he's not relevant, really, except...
He's not a player anymore.
No, of course he's not. But it's just because I worked for him for so long and I knew him so well, I do think he's a sort of a gauge of how permanent Washington feels about things. And Christo was saying in public, right up until that famous debate in South Carolina about Trump, he's kind of a buffoon, but, he could be our buffoon, and maybe we can ride this to power again in Washington over Hillary. This was in 2016. The second, this has been much noted by people smarter than I, but the second Trump went after the Iraq war on a core level, that was not a good idea from day one. When he said that, that was it. And yeah, foreign policy is what they really care about. And it's just a tragedy, but it is the end result of really kind of 80 years of corruption that all of us, very much including me, should have noticed at the time and called out at the time. And we didn't. I didn't. And again, this is like something to remember about life. It's like you can get so focused on what you're fighting against that you fail to honestly assess what you're fighting for and the way that you're fighting for it. And I think it's very important to be honest about our own behavior and to take, relentlessly clear-eyed stock of ourselves all the time. All the time. Like I can say, it's easy to be against bad things. You see this in DC all the time. But Putin, he's bad. Hitler's bad. Great. Okay. But let's talk about you for a minute. Are you good? Are you bad? What exactly are you doing? What are your aims? Putin bad. Great. Got it. Putin bad. Got it. Message received. But let's talk about you, my leader, for a moment. Shut up! Putin bad. And I think all of us are like that to some extent. I know that I was. Saddam Hussein bad. Yeah, okay. That's an easy call, I guess. I didn't even care, actually, but whatever. At the time, I was like, he's bad. Okay. He gassed the Kurds. Okay. How are we responding to it? What I can control is me, to some extent, my country, what's done in my name with my money. And I fell down on the job and did not do that because we were so focused. And I just think this is a recurring problem in human affairs.
Are you encouraged at least some of the American right is waking up from this neoconservative spell, that we've made some progress?
Well, yeah, and I've been...
J.D. Vance being the VP with...
Yes, and I've been reminded of that in the last 24 hours. I did this interview with a guy who seemed totally reasonable and moderate to me and wasn't saying anything crazy.
Daryl Cooper?
Daryl Cooper, yeah. Really nice man and a very moderate man. I had dinner with him the night before for like 5 hours and just talked about history and all. Not that much about the Second World War, actually, but other things. And my read on him was he's not a hater, that's for sure. And he's like a reasonable guy, and maybe you disagree with him, but okay, that's okay. We're each allowed to have
That's
our
kind
own.
of where I'm at. I don't know if I don't think I agree with a lot of it.
It's fine. I mean, I
okay.
agree with, well, I'll just say for the record, what I agree with is the UK is a disaster. Truly.
Your analysis of how the UK has become a husk of its former self.
Yes, and a kind of disappearing country and disappearing people, and like they're done. And I'm not just saying this because I'm half English, which I'm not proud of, but I am. And it's nothing to do with that, actually. It just has to do with this was an amazing country, and now it's a disgusting country. And like, how did that happen? And if Churchill was such a great leader, how, 80 years later, is his country basically gone? And I think it's important to understand how that happened. That's my opinion.
And someone should have to answer for that.
I totally agree. So, but whatever conclusions you reach, I was amazed in the last 24 hours. You platform. I had Seth Dillon from the Babylon Bee, who's like some anti-woke guy, I guess, text me. I can't believe you platformed him. Platformed? You mean talk to him? It's like, okay. I thought you were the anti-woke guy. But anyway, people are very upset. And look, it's okay to be upset about a difference of opinion. I totally get it. I'm frequently upset about differences of opinion. But I can't help but detect in the hysteria over all of this, trying to turn Daryl Cooper, maybe he's got eccentric views or not, but into some sort of a Nazi and me into a platformer of Nazis. I detect in that something much bigger, which is a kind of desperate, hysterical attempt to hold on to certain ideas or founding myths, some of which may be worth holding on to or not or whatever. I'm agnostic.
Mythologies can be important, as astutely pointed.
I totally agree. Blake Neff made that point, whom I love.
Blake's amazing.
I totally agree. He made that point to me last night. All societies are founded on myths, and it's important to have a founding myth. And maybe this isn't the worst one. I think that's a great point, and he may be absolutely right. But a confident society, a confident ruling class, would be able to explain that in the way that 100%. He did, non-hysterically, rationally. And that's not what we're seeing at all. We're seeing people like losing control. And I think that is sort of the point of it. They are losing control.
For those that didn't listen to the episode quickly, what was the synthesis would you say? I mean,
synthesis was, well, we talked about all kinds of different things.
Jonestown cult, which was something else.
Completely the sadness of modern Britain, the destruction of Ireland, which is really a fixation for me because it's just so bizarre. Why would you want to destroy Ireland? What did they do wrong? Replace it with people who aren't from Ireland.
Have they not suffered enough? I mean,
well, kind of. They were never an imperial power. It's all very weird. But anyway, and worth talking about. But no, Daryl Cooper said, I think the villain of the Second World War period was Churchill, which is a provocative thing to say for sure. But I don't know. Tell me more. Why do you think that? And his point was, look, there was this regional conflict underway. Germany was pissed about the concessions that it was forced to make under the Treaty of Versailles after the First World War, and they wanted their land back and their population, German-speaking, ethnic German population in all these different countries. And so it was a regional conflict. And you can take either side of that or no side or whatever, but it was effectively a regional conflict, and Churchill forced it into what it became, which was a global war in which tens of millions of people died. That's his position. Okay. I mean, I think that's a defensible position. It may be a wrong position. I don't think that's like crazy. It certainly doesn't justify the hysteria that it provoked, in my opinion. And so the question is, well, why did it provoke
that was going to be my
that
question.
hysteria?
Because I don't get that much emotional about it. I don't think I agree with that.
I agree.
But I'm not an expert, I'm not a historian.
But it's okay.
It also doesn't get me screaming, right?
So I guess I would ask, like, which is more dangerous, living in a society where, people have all kinds of views, heterodox views about a historical event, or living in a society in which you're not allowed to have heterodox views on an event, an 80-year-old event? I mean, it's not a close call for me. You want to live in a free society where inquiry, free inquiry is encouraged, certainly allowed. And so, but the point is, why the hysteria? And I think if you take 3 steps back, I think this is right. What you're looking at is is it the end of an 80-year cycle, and the end of a certain way of thinking about the world, the end of a certain way of administering. But the bottom, whatever we want, may be immaterial because it's not continuing. It's ending, and it's ending very fast. And again, that's upsetting. I'm certainly not, poor Seth Dillon from the Babylon Bee. Like, I kind of get why people are upset. He couldn't quite articulate it, but I get it. They don't want, the reason they're upset is because if people start questioning the myth, then it's like, well, but wait, then what's the justification for all of this? And then we need to accept that we are at the end of a stage of history. And that's a scary thing. It's scary for me, by the way. I'm certainly not celebrating any of this at all. I feel anxiety. I can feel it.
I feel it in the air too.
Yeah. So I do think that a year from now, the debates that we're having now about Churchill or whatever, they will all seem silly and antique. Like, I do think things are changing faster.
Do you mean that we're going to have real problems?
Well, I just think assumptions are changing really fast, and about a lot of different things. I don't think all of it's good, by the way. I'm not for radical change, at all. I'm conservative.
Be careful what statues you tear down.
I totally agree, completely agree. This is not up to me. I'm just observing.
No, I mean,
and there are a million factors.
Usually it doesn't go well, right?
I agree with that.
Yeah.
I agree with that. And certainly big changes cause a lot of suffering, inevitably. But we're clearly on the cusp of one or in the middle of one. There's just no way around that. Again, I just want to say, I don't want this to happen. I wouldn't choose any of this. I wish it was 1985 again. I don't want to think about any of this stuff.
What a great country that was.
Right? It was great. I'd kind of like to go just bird hunting with my dogs and not worry about stuff. But I'm not in charge. None of us is in charge individually of history, and we're sort of captives of it. And this really is a historical pivot point. I don't think that's grandiose or overstating the case at all. I think it's absolutely true, and everyone can feel it. And it makes them jumpy and, to some extent, hysterical. People are coming at me last night by text message, and I was sort of confused about it at first because I was maybe being like too autistic about it or too literal, or like, no, Daryl Cooper is, a really good and moderate and non-hating person, which is all true, by the way, absolutely true. I think he's a great historian, whether you agree or disagree, but he's like rigorous. And let's debate what you think he got wrong. Like, I'm coming at it from that perspective.
Yes,
like, oh, you're mad at him. You're calling him.
I want to see him debate Dr. Arndt on Churchill, who's like the Churchill.
100%. Yeah. No, Larry Arndt's amazing on Churchill.
He's like the Churchill guy. I texted him like, you should talk to him.
Completely different perspective.
Right?
That would be wonderful. I totally agree with that. So that's the, again, kind of probably too literal position that I'm coming at this from. And so I was amazed just the vituperative nature of this, and people really getting upset. And then I thought, rather than just push back and be like, up yours too, like, what are we watching here?
What are we pivoting towards? You say we're pivoting.
I don't, that's opaque to me. I don't know.
Does the election have a bearing on that?
Oh, of course it does. But I don't think it's the sum total of it at all.
I think it's a piece,
really don't. Right? But more to the point, I guess the only point I'm making is like, if people are behaving in a way that you disagree with or despise, or think is disgusting, I do think before pushing back, or maybe in the midst of pushing back, it's worth asking, like, what is this? Like, why are they doing this? These aren't all stupid people. They're not all bad people. A lot of good people, actually. I've always liked Seth Dillon. I'm not, you know what I mean? Like, so why? What is this about? And I do think it's about the sense that all of us have, that things are now really changing fast. And people are afraid of what's next, me included, absolutely. And if you start to question the myths that underpin the current order, that you are really playing with fire and we could get something much worse. And I don't think that's crazy. I don't think it's crazy at all. I get it. But I don't think that these changes are coming because someone questioned whether Churchill was a good leader for Britain. I don't think that. I think it's much deeper than that. But anyway, that's it. People are jumpy right now.
Very jumpy.
And they have every reason to be. And the last thing I would say about the election.
Yeah, because I do want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah,
because you called 16 correctly. You saw the trends. You wrote that amazing Politico piece. I remember it. You said Trump was vulgar, but he was right. And you talk about how you insulted his hair. Yeah. And he called you. And he's like, you're right. You have better hair than I do, but I get more
ladies than you do.
I'm using a nice...
Use a colloquial term I will not repeat.
But it was a great piece. And basically, I have the quote here. It says, he exists because you failed.
That is totally true.
But now here we are 8 years later. Where are we?
It's hard to know. I mean, Trump has not done a lot of things that I wish he had done. But the main thing that he has done is revealed, the depth of the corruption at the heart of the enterprise. But it hasn't been corrected at all. And no one he's implicated has repented of what they've done, admitted it.
Repentance means humility, which means higher power. And so it's against the rules of DC.
Exactly right. So that puts us in a pretty troubling position. So the people who've benefited from the current system they know they're exposed, so they're afraid. They're desperate, and they're totally without limits. They'll do anything. So that makes them very, very dangerous. But this is also playing out against the backdrop of a world that is changing really, really fast. That's absolutely beyond our control. The economic structure of the world is changing.
With rapidity.
Yeah, so that's really the story, is that the money is going east big time. And it's manufacturing and resources. It were the things that it's always been. You take natural resources and you make things with them. That's your economy. And we went through this period of decades.
You mean it's not shorts on the market?
It's not. It's not.
It's not hedge funds, and it's not.
No, loaning money at interest is part of an economy, but if it becomes the basis of your economy, then it's not really a real economy. Right. And no, an economy is based on taking natural resources, things that God made, and making them into something useful for
human
people
beings to flourish.
That's exactly. That's what your economy is based on, and ours no longer is, and China's is. And anyway, you know the story. But the point is, this is all changing super, super fast. And I do think that the one thing that we should keep in mind is that we don't know what happens next. And there's this really interesting phenomenon that I've just noticed as I've gotten older, that almost always the things that you think are victories turn out to be disappointing at best and very often failures. And the things that you think are failures are actually victories. And it's a biblical principle.
Of course it is.
Which I didn't realize.
The first will be last and the last will be first.
Exactly right. The meek shall inherit the earth. The meek? Really?
You could spend
How do the meek win in the end?
Your whole year reading that. You're like, I don't understand it.
Right. So of course it's a theological truth as revealed by Jesus in the New Testament, but it's also a kind of unerring commentary on the way life really is. And that's true in our lives. And very often, not very often in my life, 100% of the time, the things that I think are true tragedies are actually the beginning of rebirth and growth and of joy. The root of my joy are the bad things that have happened to me. It's just a fact. I didn't make these rules. I just noticed this.
It's in the scriptures, it says, count it all blessing. Count it all a blessing.
That has just been true for me.
And that your trials are actually a blessing. It's James 1:5.
It's exactly right. True, yes. It is true. I haven't had many bad things happen to me. I've had an incredibly easy and happy life. But, like the little dramas that have happened in my life, which didn't seem little to me when they were happening, have turned out to be like the foundation of my joy. So That's something to remember in the context of American politics. Like you think, well, we elect this person and all of our problems will be solved. It might actually turn out the opposite from what you think or expect. Or if we elect this person, we're going down this path. We're going to be Soviet America, which is clearly where we're moving very quickly right now. I don't know if that's actually true. But what I do know for a fact is that we're not God and we can't know. And so you should always be alive to the possibility that you're completely wrong. That the inverse will have, that there will be a sort of paradox baked in, as there is almost invariably in life. Wow, I thought that was a win. How many people do I know personally who, working toward, getting really rich, got really rich,
and become miserable?
Oh my gosh. Oh, that's a cliche for a reason. How many people do I know who had something like really bad happen to them and they realized, wow, that was like the greatest blessing they could have had. Anyway,
with limitations, there's some tragedy that's so.
For sure.
Yeah.
I don't wish tragedy on anyone. I seek to avoid tragedy every day of my life. I'm not embracing tragedy. I'm just saying it's important to know the limitations of your ability to see the future.
Everything you're saying is inherently spiritual. You think there's a spiritual dynamic to all of this. And can you talk just briefly, I know we're running out of time, how your spiritual journey has deepened in the last couple of years? I know you've been reading the Bible even more. As an Episcopalian, that seems to be quite an accomplishment.
Reading the Bible even more. Well, I didn't read the Bible at all before. So
I'm being generous.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't had much of a spiritual journey. I'm such a flawed person that I don't even want to be associated with Christianity because I don't want to discredit it. But I mean that.
That means you're a true Christian.
Oh, I don't know. I don't want to be called that. But I'm very superstitious on that point. No, I'm a really flawed person, obviously. But yeah, I mean, I think I will say this. There is a Christian revival underway in the United States, a low-key Christian revival. I see it all around me. It's not the kind of tent revival that you imagine from, 1923. It's something else. It's a different manifestation of the same thing. Yes. And I see it everywhere. And by everywhere, I mean in the conversations that I have with people I'm talking to, where people who've lived totally secular lives, as I have, I've lived a very secular life, are all of a sudden referring to God or some power beyond themselves in a way that would have been really striking 5 years ago. Yes. No one I knew, I mean, you're from a different world, a world that's much more in touch with the spiritual, with the transcendent, but I'm not. I mean, I'm from a world that's in touch with like what is happening today. That's it. I've never heard people talk like that, ever. And now practically everyone I know is talking like that. What is that? And that's a sign to me that, yes, the spiritual realm is like obvious to people who had never thought about it before.
What I'm seeing is that people are asking the question, why are they doing this? And the spiritual is the only explanation.
Of course.
Because it defies reason.
That's exactly the conclusion that I have come to. And it didn't make any sense to me because I was looking at politics through the lens of, what I thought was accurate 20 years ago. We're having a debate over how to improve people's lives. And now, of course, there's no reference to improving people's lives. In fact, the explicit intent is to crush people's lives. So, like, what is that? Well, it's evil. That's what it is.
Tucker, last question. We had you on before. Advice for young people right now in America that are listening. We have a lot of younger viewers.
Oh, gather your people to you. If you know that, winter's coming, you want to stack up on, cordwood and high-carb snacks. It's like an instinct, put your acorns away. Yeah, there's a lot of volatility coming. There's no question about it. And so the only way to protect yourself is with your relationships with the people that you love and keep them close to you. Stay in touch with them. Marry one of them if you can.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Keep your people close. Create more people. I mean, I do think that's the ultimate gesture of defiance in the face of chaos is to reproduce. Amen. I wish I could do more of it, but I'm too old.
You would have more kids?
Oh, are you joking? Yeah. So my wife and I always say, I can't believe we only had 4 kids. That's what we did.
Tucker, thanks so much, man.
Charlie Kirsch, great to see you.
Thanks.
Thank you.